Deep Sea Embers Chapter 331 to 340. Once smooth and pristine, the paper was now marred and crinkled, splotched by an unusual gray-black substance that the layman might mistake for mud. This mud had invaded multiple areas of the paper, disrupting the ink and rendering some of the script smeared and fragmented. Yet, thanks to the scrupulous efforts of Morris, who treated the damaged document with painstaking care, a large portion of the words had been recovered and rendered just legible enough to be deciphered. The written record belonged to Scott Brown, and chronicled the bizarre physical transformations he experienced during his last clear and rational moments. Roughly at 4 a.m., which marked 12 hours since I had locked and secured the door, I was struck with intense ringing in my ear. Accompanied by sporadic bouts of dizziness, it impaired my ability to move around. I could only muster the strength to write during those brief periods when I felt marginally better. I detected what appeared to be blood pooling beneath my skin, accompanied by bruises that had surfaced without any apparent cause. At around 6:30 a.m., I experienced a sensation as if my internal organs were in complete disarray. It felt as though the structures within me had morphed, each assuming its own unique role, and started shifting. There was no pain, and the dizziness had also ebbed away. My fear began to dissolve, and in its place, vivid memories started to resurface. Close to 7 a.m., my memory served me with starkly clear images of my own death. The realization dawned upon me that the original version of me had already perished. Inexplicably, my left leg had fractured. It was as if a portion of the bone had suddenly disintegrated and disappeared. At 8:15 a.m., the disintegration of my left leg began. It started with spontaneous cracks appearing on the skin, followed by the internal tissues leaking out in the form of a gray-black fluid. The fluid appeared to display signs of life, wriggling and crawling on the floor and even climbing up the walls. I feared that the wooden boards I had nailed across the window would not be able to contain these eerie and terrifying entities, but to my relief, I found that they gradually lost their activity once they left my body. Moreover, even while active, they seemed to consciously avoid sunlight. This could be a critical piece of information, so I'm noting it down here. Despite my heart having ceased to function, my consciousness remained intact. I was aware that my body was no longer operating according to regular human physiological processes. When I tried to make a cut, instead of blood, a gray-black viscous substance oozed out slowly. What was my body composed of at this point? The dissolution process started spreading to my entire lower half. I had to strain myself to stay still and continue documenting these observations. I no longer felt any pain, had no breath, and my heart had stopped functioning long ago. At times, I could hear a humming sound, as if the substance that now formed my body was resonating. The viscous substance kept leaking out, turning the room into a mess. I hope Garloni is not frightened when she comes to clean the room, although, as I pen down her name, I can barely remember what Garloni looks like. At 10:30 a.m., what I feared the most started to happen. My vision began to deteriorate rapidly, and my surroundings quickly faded into darkness. I had to feel the edges of the paper to keep my writing legible. I am not sure of the exact time now, but it must be somewhere between 11 a.m. and 12 p.m. I heard a sharp, unusual noise that lasted for approximately 5 minutes, after which all discomfort began to fade, and the sensation in the remaining parts of my body rapidly diminished. I could vaguely feel the area below my chest sinking. Perhaps another hour has passed. "Do you need some time alone?" asked Duncan, his voice calm as he studied the old man. "I can wait for you outside." "No need, I've already mourned him once," Morris replied gently, shaking his head. "I just didn't expect to come across his academic records again after 6 long years. This information is valuable, isn't it?" Duncan didn't reply immediately. Instead, he leaned in closer to study the gray-black mud, now hardened and motionless, scrutinizing its edges meticulously. He then picked up the last record left by Scott Brown, carefully examining the areas where the paper was soaked thoroughly by the mud. The borders where the paper met the mud were slightly blurred and irregular. The distinct demarcation line seemed to have vanished, and the two materials appeared to have partially fused. Upon noticing Duncan's actions, Morris queried, "Did you discover something?" "Primal matters." Duncan lifted his gaze to meet Morris's. "The local church in Frost is conducting research on this type of substance." They believe that the viscous residue remaining after the decomposition of deep-sea replicants bears a striking similarity to the primal substances mentioned by the Annihilators. Morris paused momentarily, but by now, he had grown used to Duncan's uncanny ability to unearth new leads from the most obscure sources. He, therefore, didn't ask where this piece of information had originated from. After some contemplation, he responded, "I am familiar with the topic of primal matters. When you investigate the history of the cultists, you can't avoid running into this mysterious substance." He took a moment, seemingly organizing his thoughts, before continuing, "Just as the Suntists firmly believe that the ancient true sun will ultimately save the world, the Annihilators have a similar prophecy of salvation. They believe that one day, the Nether Lord will awaken from his deep slumber and, in his wrath, will destroy the existing world, which they believe has been manipulated and deceived by the gods. They believe that the real world, represented by the mysterious deep sea, will rise from the depths of the earth and once again become a paradise for mortal beings. Before that day arrives, primal matters will surface in large quantities. According to them, it is the blueprint of all things, the fundamental essence of the world. It will envelop everything and restore the world to its original state." As the elderly scholar narrated the tale, Duncan maintained a silence that lasted for a few seconds before he raised his head and asked, "Appear in abundance, emerge from the deep sea." Morris didn't respond immediately. "I find these Annihilators increasingly fascinating. But it's not their prophecy of salvation that intrigues me. I'm more interested in understanding how they've established a connection with the place that's located 1,000 meters below Frost." Duncan shook his head. "The replicants originate from the deep sea, as do the obsidian and the submarine found on Dagger Island. Yet, this secretive group of Annihilators, how have they managed to make contact with the force that lies a kilometer beneath the water? Building a submarine that can navigate to and from the deep sea, a kilometer beneath the surface, is no easy task, even for a powerful city-state. At the very least, this isn't something a group of cultists could achieve," Morris began, lost in thought. "However, they might be indirectly channeling the power of the deep sea, or they might be communicating with the powerful presence of the deep sea through some sort of ritualistic practices. So, there must be a larger cult stronghold hidden in Frost, a concealed location large enough to hold extensive ceremonies, potent enough to harness the power of the deep sea consistently, capable of creating replicants within the city-state, and even infiltrating Dagger Island," Duncan stated slowly, casting his gaze around the room. The room's only window had been sealed off with wooden planks, and the ceiling, walls, and floor were coated with dried, lifeless mud. Every trace in the room seemed to tell a harrowing tale of a desperate fight for survival. "Perhaps, in the end, we'll have to give the cultists here a little surprise from the vanished," he murmured softly, rubbing his fingers together. A tiny cluster of dark green flames fell from his fingertips, silently landing on the floor before rapidly disappearing. Of course, Morris noticed this, but he remained silent and glanced towards the nearby table. That was where Scott Brown had last worked. Perhaps it was a transient replicant, but as it hunched over to write while its body was collapsing, it still had a noble soul. "So, what's the plan?" The old scholar looked up at the captain. "The traces in the room, the information Brown left behind, and Garloni downstairs. We've already collected enough evidence. Let's leave the rest to the people of Frost," Duncan said, his tone indifferent. "Leave the room as it is, place the letter in a noticeable spot on the table, and prepare an anonymous tip-off letter. As for Garloni..." Duncan paused, hesitating for a moment. Garloni's cognitive interference has yet to cease. Even after the replicants in this building have disappeared, she shows no signs of regaining consciousness. She continues to believe her teacher is resting in this room. This indicates that the source of the interference isn't her teacher, but something else that's still active and hidden deep within the city-state. She won't truly recover until that source is eradicated. As he spoke, his brow furrowed slightly, as if he was considering something else. "And, we can't be certain how many other Scott Browns and Garlonis there are in this city-state." Morris's expression became grave. "You mean, rumors of the dead returning circulate in the city, while at the same time, completely contradictory news reaches Tyrion?" Duncan looked at Morris. I fear that replicants and cognitive interference have thoroughly infiltrated this city-state. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Each bedroom was then meticulously investigated in the expanse of the residence, yet they found no oddities in any of them except for the one last occupied by Scott Brown. To be specific, even the room, tainted with a viscous coating of gray-black mud, betrayed no indications of anything supernatural. Whatever was there, any elements or contamination, it had all disappeared following Scott Brown's disappearance. On the ground floor of the house, Garloni continued her undisturbed slumber. The towering figure of this orc woman, her skin a rugged texture of leathery toughness, reclined peacefully in the corner of the sofa, her pose suggestive of a serene dream of relaxation. Should Heidi have been present, she'd have brewed up some potions to ease the girl's transition from sleep to wakefulness. Morris observed Garloni's peaceful sleep from the sofa with a mix of emotions evident on his face. I can see she shared a deep bond with Brown. Dark times are fleeting, Duncan remarked, briefly pausing before withdrawing a small crystal pendant from his pocket. He muttered something under his breath to it and then gently placed it in Garloni's hand. May you have sweet dreams. Everything will improve. Morris silently observed Duncan's actions for a while before he finally asked, "Did you bring those pendants here?" "Last time, I ordered more than required and ended up with half a box of leftovers. Distributing them for free even proved to be challenging," Duncan clarified, his face unreadable primarily because it was swathed in bandages. "I thought I'd hand them out during my travels. Would you like to have one?" "No, thank you," Morris declined promptly, waving his hand dismissively. "I'm not really inclined towards such feminine adornments." "Fair enough, Under the faint glow cast by a gas lamp at the intersection, the chilling breeze of the night brushed against Vanna as she cautiously scanned her surroundings in the quiet alley. Beside her, Alice stood, trying to imitate the vigilance of the Inquisitor by looking around, though it was clear she had no understanding of what Vanna was on the lookout for. "The streets are eerily silent. Not a soul is around." The doll lady finally broke the silence, likely unaccustomed to the pressing quietude. "Miss Vanna, what are you trying to discern in our surroundings?" Vanna answered calmly, "I'm trying to spot any supernatural individuals or suspicious shadows lurking around the building." "Ah," Alice stared blankly. "Will there be any? Why do you think Mr. Duncan had us wait outside?" After contemplating for a moment, Alice replied, "Isn't it because he thinks I am a hindrance?" "Vanna, you're right." She found it increasingly difficult to explain the situation to this naive individual, and so decided to let it be. However, she understood the significance of her vigilance here. A duplicate that had returned from the deep sea had been active in the city-state for several days, and this duplicate resided in a nearby building. It was unthinkable that the Annihilators, the followers of the Nether Lord, would remain indifferent to this. It could even be a conspiracy devised by the cultists themselves. Mr. Duncan and Mr. Morris had ventured inside the house for an investigation, both to gather intel and possibly to draw out any lurking cultists. Would the cultists be monitoring this location? Would the entity that resurrected Scott Brown reveal any activity tonight? Would there be hidden shadows in these alleyways? If unexpected guests arrived, would the shadows remain inert? Vanna controlled her breath and heartbeat, hiding her presence and power. After ascertaining the continued silence of the street, she retreated into the shadows of the buildings. Suddenly, she saw Alice lean forward as if she'd been brainwashed. The puppet girl raised her hand and, with a pop sound, removed her head. She then leaned against the wall, cradling her head in one hand while shaking it back and forth in the open. Even Vanna, the seasoned Inquisitor, was taken aback by this sight. She stared and whispered, "What are you doing?" With another pop sound, Alice quickly reattached her head, looking innocent. "I was checking for any movements outside." "The next time you plan on doing such a thing, warn me first." Vanna glared at the puppet girl but stopped midway through her sentence, dismissively waving her hand. "Forget it." Alice looked puzzled, but as she was about to speak, she seemed to sense something and instinctively glanced outside. "Miss Vanna, I feel like there's someone nearby, but I can't see them." "Someone nearby." Vanna instantly became alert. She didn't let Alice's typical unreliability affect her vigilance but instead honed her senses, evaluating the surrounding ambience and asked in a hushed tone, "Where?" "Just diagonally opposite, under that streetlight," Alice whispered, even crouching down to exhibit her caution, and pointed towards the entrance of the alley, "but I only saw lines, not people." At first, Vanna was perplexed and just looked in the direction Alice indicated. It took her a few seconds to understand what Alice meant, asking, "Lines? What lines?" "The lines on people, the ones that everyone has, floating from their bodies to the sky," Alice casually explained. "They're on the back of the head, on the hands and feet." As she spoke, she suddenly paused and added, "Oh right, Mr. Duncan doesn't have them, but that's normal since he's Mr. Duncan." As Alice continued to talk, her voice slowly faded until she became silent. Even Alice, as simple-minded as she was, could finally notice the odd expression on Vanna's face. "You can't see them." The puppet girl hesitated for a moment, considering the only possible explanation. I won't laugh at you. The captain said that everyone's eyes are different. I can't see them, but that's not the primary concern right now." Vanna refocused and concentrated intensely on the nearby streetlight. "Are the lines still there?" She understood the importance of prioritizing. Alice could see invisible lines floating on human bodies, and she had always naturally assumed this was a commonplace sight and that others could see them too. It was such a given that this ability only surfaced now through an offhand remark. This might be her unique power as Anomaly 099, or there could be a more intricate and extraordinary explanation behind it. Regardless, these matters shouldn't be probed at this time. Someone was hiding nearby, and they were now exposed in the puppet's line of sight. That was what mattered the most. "They're still there, wavering a bit left and right," Alice whispered as she glanced at the streetlight diagonally across from them. However, she then knitted her brows. It seems like a few are missing." Missing a few. Vanna's heart clenched, and in the next second, her alertness reached a new high. Years of honed battle instincts and the warning of impending danger gifted by the goddess surged through her senses, directing her gaze to a specific spot deep within the alley. Darkness stirred within the eerie shadows untouched by the streetlight, and a skeletal figure emerged. In an instant, a grotesque monster materialized, attached to the skeletal figure with chains. It was a person, or at least it still had the semblance of one. However, their body was distorted and swollen to a horrifying degree. Their skin appeared as if burnt by intense flames, black and curled as their bones grew irregularly, forming a series of discontinuous bone plates on the surface of their body. Sharp bone spikes protruded from their back, reminiscent of a deep-sea creature's remains. Where their face should have been, there was only a hollow indentation with a flickering, dark red glow. Just from that glance, Vanna identified what it was: an annihilation priest, someone who had reached a deep symbiosis with a shadow demon and purified their body to an extreme degree. The Annihilators viewed their flesh and blood as a prison created by the gods. As such, their method of expressing loyalty to the Nether Lord was to continually use demonic powers to transform their bodies, purifying their forms. This process caused them to develop more and more demonic characteristics, making them less and less human. Cultists who had purified themselves to a certain degree could no longer revert to a human form, even with temporary transformation spells, and could not function within human society. Instead, they relied on lower-ranking cultists for support. In return, they gained more potent abilities and a stronger, more direct connection with the shadowy depths. These cultists were indeed observing this place. As this realization shot through Vanna's mind, her body was already in motion. Given that she had to move around the city-state, she hadn't brought her blessed steel greatsword. But for a faithful priestess of the storm goddess, a sword was hardly an inconvenient item. Air compressed, water vapor condensed, and the breath of the sea and wind instantly formed an icy blade in her hand, barely sufficient. Heretic. Vanna's lithe body launched into the sky with the force of a hurricane, the freezing northern winds coursing through her veins, empowering her as though she was the embodiment of a tempest. As her form rose, a blade of pure ice crystallized in her grip, reflecting the ethereal glow of the world's creation and casting a shimmering frosty light in the cold darkness. With a grace born of countless battles, she swung the blade downward in a sweeping arc that split the air itself. As the blade cleaved through the atmosphere, the violent disruption caused the surrounding air currents to collide with such force that they generated waves of intense heat and visual distortion. Halfway through its descent, the icy blade took on a plasma-like appearance, its edge wreathed in incandescent flame that danced around the ice, a bewildering spectacle of fire entwined with ice. The sheer exotic beauty of the sight was enough to cause the devilish cultist to falter in his assault. For the Annihilation Priest, the scenario should have played out quite differently. He had meticulously planned his ambush, discovering the unexpected visitor early and using his arsenal of spells to shroud his existence. His unique demonic form allowed him to temporarily suppress his life signs, making him practically undetectable. Yet, against all odds, his impeccable camouflage had been uncovered by the prey. Now, the hunter had become the hunted, and the prey had transformed into a predator more formidable than he had ever anticipated. Vanna's blade descended like a meteor, leaving the Annihilation Priest with no time for a counterattack. In a desperate bid to survive, he unleashed a chilling, eerie shriek that was imbued with a powerful curse. Layer upon layer of black bone plates and rock-like shields sprung into existence, forming a formidable barrier between him and the impending onslaught. Moreover, a towering demon, constructed of jagged bone fragments, materialized under the command of a pact, standing like a guardian in front of its master. The monstrous figure opened its maw, preparing to release a corrosive breath attack. As the dust settled, the skeletal demon's true form fully emerged from the shadows. It was a gargantuan hound, a horrific shadowy beast that towered over any normal dog. Unfazed by the formidable obstacles before her, Vanna showed no intention of halting her advance. Boom! The deafening explosion echoed through the silent night, accompanied by a chorus of high-pitched, grating sounds. With a single, decisive chop, Vanna's icy blade shattered the energy barrier conjured by the Annihilation Priest, crumbled the rock shields, nullified the acid breath of the dark hound, and even cleaved half of the demon's skull, sending shards of bone flying in all directions. The impact's shockwave raced through the alley like a tempest, scouring away dust and smoke. The decapitated hound howled in agony as it was thrown backward, dragging along the Annihilation Priest who was bound by the symbiotic chain. The pair tumbled over the rough terrain before finally coming to a stop, struggling to regain their footing. The warped form of the cult priest shuddered violently, the blowback from his demon's injury rendering him disoriented. Under the dim light, it was difficult to distinguish between the hound and the once human priest, their forms so horribly twisted and merged. Despite having half its head cleaved away, the dark hound managed to rise, its life force surprisingly resilient. It growled defiantly in Vanna's direction as it continued to shed damaged bone fragments. Vanna, her expression as calm as ever, casually discarded the shattered remnants of the icy blade, its purpose served. The Annihilation Priest across the alley was making a tremendous effort to lift his head, struggling to regain consciousness. Strained demonic whispers slipped from his lips, setting the stage for the enactment of his curse. Vanna raised her hand, catching the solid mass of decaying bones and rocks hurled at her. She disregarded the wisps of smoke curling up from her palm and continued her relentless march. With her free hand, she seized the half-headed dark hound and stuffed the cursed mass into its gaping neck wound. The demonic hound fought back instinctively but was helpless against Vanna's superhuman strength. In its struggle, the hound tore off the remaining half of its own head while the cursed missile, empowered by its own life force, was forcefully shoved into its stomach. The bone plates inside the demon began to fracture, filling its innards with sparks of brilliant light. Vanna swiftly lifted her foot, kicking the primed to explode demon away, and casually grabbed the nearby Annihilation Priest, using him as a shield. With a resounding explosion, the kicked hound detonated mid-flight, and the fragments of bones rained down like lethal shrapnel, riddling the body of the priest held aloft by Vanna. But the priest was not dead yet, writhing in agony, his pain making him curl up into a pitiful ball. The entire encounter had been brief and intense. Your symbiotic demon is dead. According to your body's mutation level, you have approximately 6 minutes to live, Vanna said, tossing the cult priest to the ground and stepping on what seemed to be his head. I know that your kind would rather die than talk, but I'm willing to give it a shot. You have 3 minutes to say your last words, and based on what you say, I'll decide how you die in the remaining 3 minutes. Near the entrance of the alley, Alice had been observing the entire encounter, completely bewildered by the rapid sequence of events. She had watched as Vanna effortlessly dispatched an enemy, obliterated a grotesque creature that bore some resemblance to dog, and reduced the initial attacker to a state of near death. While she didn't understand what exactly had happened, one thing was clear: Vanna was incredibly powerful. This realization filled the puppet girl with excitement, and she began to clap her hands enthusiastically. "Miss Vanna, you're amazing!" she cheered. However, in her moment of distraction, she seemed to have forgotten about the few threads that were still floating under the streetlight across the alley. The air near the entrance of the alley warped subtly, signaling the entrance of the second attacker that's been lurking in the shadows. The showdown between Vanna and the Annihilation Priest had transpired too rapidly, and the ensuing chaos in the alley had greatly surpassed the hidden attacker's expectations. As the second cultist finally revealed himself, he found himself stopped short at the sight of Vanna standing over the fallen Annihilation Priest. The cultist hesitated, glancing between the brutal scene inside the alley and the blonde woman beside him. Then, without a second thought, the muscular man turned on his heel and sprinted away. But after just a few steps, he heard a voice from behind. "Hey! Wait up!" Suddenly, he felt a forceful tug on his body as if he had been ensnared. He came to a halt, unable to resist the intense pulling sensation that seemed to originate from his very joints. Terrified, the cultist turned around to see black smoke swirling around him. His demon, tethered to him, attempted to struggle and counterattack, but it was held back by an unseen force lurking in the shadows. He looked further and found the long-haired blonde woman in a dress, her hand stretched out, seemingly gripping something invisible. "Don't go yet," Alice said, holding onto the string and gazing at the fleeing cultist, trying to make her expression more menacing. "The captain said people like you are bad and shouldn't be let go. You'll harm others." Not too far away, a third annihilator who had just sprinted out of the alley hung suspended in midair, his body contorted into an odd and ridiculous pose, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. Fear filled his eyes as he glanced at the blonde woman. Summoning all his will to survive, he had barely managed to break free from the pulling sensation. He exerted all his remaining strength into a flick of his wrist. A prepared rune scroll slipped out from his sleeve. "Choose life, and devour," he mumbled the words with difficulty, his voice interspersed with demonic whispers. The pre-stored spell was triggered, and the rune scroll ignited midair before it could touch the ground. The spell had activated, and its target included every living being within its radius. Yet, nothing happened despite the scroll disintegrating into flames. The cultist's eyes widened in horror and disbelief as he witnessed the scene. Not far away, Alice looked just as surprised. She didn't breathe, she didn't have a heartbeat. And she had no idea what had just happened. But she quickly figured out that the cultist had tried to kill her. Fear gripped the lady, so she tugged forcefully on the string in her hand. "The captain said that when I'm outside, I have to protect myself." The cultist's body froze. The slight freedom he had managed to wrest was completely stripped away then. He could no longer move his wrists or lips. A peculiar numbness began to spread, his body rapidly stiffening and turning cold, transforming into something that was not flesh and blood. Before he knew it, the world around him turned dark. But the next second, something emerged from the darkness. A hollow, deep voice that seemed to emanate directly from his chest echoed in his ears. "Ah, a new attendant has arrived." A new servant had made his arrival. This proclamation seemed to set off a mechanical chain of reactions. Accompanied by a throaty, muted reverberation, a multitude of obscure forms began to coalesce from the surrounding murkiness before the figure known as the Annihilator. An indeterminable, flickering light bathed the expansive, time-worn, and grandiose hall, revealing its stately elegance. His eyes widened in awe, taking in the spectacle of the hall that seemed to boast the opulence of a palace, yet it also exuded an air of prolonged desertion as if untouched for decades on end. He observed a curved staircase gracefully spiraling skyward at the far end, bridging the elevated walkway and platform above. Enormous pillars stood like silent sentinels, their vague outlines just perceivable in the gloomy light. Plush draperies cascaded from the pinnacle of these pillars, dancing ever so gently in the phantom breeze. The walls of the hall were flanked by dark, desolate windows, firmly sealed behind crisscrossed steel bars. Between these windows, colossal, indistinct paintings hung, brimming with unsettling, vibrant patches, void of any identifiable figures or scenery. The Annihilator stood entranced by the scene. Abruptly, he realized that the restrictive feeling that had gripped his limbs had dissipated. Taking 2 tentative steps forward, he reveled in the regained control of his body, then instinctively sent a call for the demon sharing his soul. Yet, all that echoed back from the depths of his soul was a hollow, mournful wail, as if the shadow demon had been a figment of his imagination. There was no response to his summoning call. "Servant, proceed to the end of the carpet," instructed the deep, muffled voice, this time originating directly within his mind. "Who's there?" The Annihilator's eyes widened in terror, his gaze sweeping across the grandiose yet unsettlingly vacant mansion hall, yet he encountered no living soul. He cast his gaze towards the end of the hall, where a dark red carpet unfurled from beneath his feet, disappearing into the distance, ending at the staircase that curved like wings connecting to the second level. Somehow, his legs began to move involuntarily as his gaze landed there, almost as if heeding the command from the disembodied voice he had just heard. He proceeded towards the end of the carpet, halting a few paces from the staircase. Suddenly, an apparition appeared before him, a body garbed in a svelte black suit devoid of a head. This decapitated figure stood ramrod straight before the staircase, impeccably dressed. A meticulously folded handkerchief peeked out from the breast pocket, and a gold watch chain gleamed from another. One hand cradled a brass bell, while the other stretched forward as if extending a welcoming gesture to a newcomer. It was an image akin to a trusted steward dutifully overseeing the mansion's affairs. But he was devoid of a head. Where a head should have rested atop the black-clad body, there was only an exposed neck, resembling the joint of a puppet. What is this place? The man could not recollect why he had been drawn to this sealed mansion or even his identity or origins. All he was aware of was an instinctual fear, a creeping sense of unfamiliarity gradually gnawing at his heart. He stared at the headless steward before him and summoned the courage to query. Concurrently, he heard whispering voices and sensed unseen eyes observing him from all corners. "Welcome, new servant," came a voice as the reply. Stunned, he pivoted his gaze to take in the spectacle within the hall. Silhouettes, garbed as stewards and maids, scurried around, evident servants attending to the mansion's immense size. These headless figures flitted by the staircase, seemingly sizing up the newcomer with curious interest. Subdued discussions emanated from their decapitated necks. Where their heads should have been, there were only smooth, bulbous appendages, akin to doll joints, with a texture hovering between wood and porcelain. The new servant stared in bafflement at the busy stewards and maids populating the hall, momentarily disoriented. Had there been so many people here before? Had the hall been buzzing with activity when he had first arrived? "This is Alice's mansion, and you are the new servant here," the voice of the steward boomed out suddenly, disrupting the new servant's reverie. "Follow me, your next assignment lies upstairs." Automatically, the new servant nodded and trailed behind the headless steward. Unconsciously, he glanced down and realized that he was now dressed as a servant, identical to the male stewards in the hall. His mind spiraled into further confusion, and he felt as if his memories were being slowly stripped away from him, deemed unnecessary and impurities hindering his service in the mansion. With each stride up the staircase, his hesitation dwindled. Initially, he faintly remembered that he didn't belong here. Then, he only remembered being trapped in an enigmatic mansion. By the time he reached the final steps leading to the second floor, all he remembered were the steward's orders. Stepping onto the last stair, he lifted his gaze to the platform and the corridor within. Several stewards passed through the corridor, and despite lacking sight, the new servant couldn't shake off the sensation of being scrutinized. "Why is everyone observing me?" "Because you are the first servant with a head." The steward paused and turned around, his voice tinged with amusement. "And it's been many years since we've had a fresh face." "What should I do?" the new servant queried cautiously. "Serve our mistress and assimilate among us. You will instinctively learn your duties. But first, you must pay your respects to the mistress." The steward slowly elevated his arm, gesturing towards a black door at the end of the corridor. "Proceed, open that door, and greet the mistress." The new servant nodded and advanced towards the door. His steps were firm, and his countenance gradually steadied while his limbs moved, slowly becoming as stiff and mechanical as those of the stewards in the hall. He reached the door, extended both hands, and calmly observed his wrist, which had transformed into a spherical joint. With minimal exertion, he pushed open the door. The puppet ventured forward. In the opulent bedroom that bordered on monumental, a magnificent bed stood as the centerpiece, encircled by drapes adorned with intricate patterns and tassels. A silver-haired doll lay tranquilly on the bed, in deep slumber. Beyond the bed, where a wall should have been, was a boundless expanse of darkness, seemingly leading to an unfathomable space. The floor, walls, and ceiling seemed fractured and disintegrated, and the chaotic darkness, dotted with innumerable twinkling lights in the distance, undulated slowly, generating surreal light and shadow illusions. They swirled silently at the end of the bedroom, whispering and wandering within the darkness. The oscillating darkness and lights seemed to mirror the doll's dreams, as if an unseen force sought to breach the mansion but was held at bay by the doll's sleep. The new servant, now metamorphosed into a puppet, stood at the entrance of the bedroom, blankly gazing at the enchanting doll ensconced on the bed in the undulating darkness behind her. Assisted by threads extending from his limbs, he bowed deferentially towards the lady of the house. The threads floated momentarily before vanishing into thin air. Once done, the new servant slowly retreated until he exited the room. The door to the sleeping Alice slammed shut with a resonant, commanding bang. But the transformation was complete. The man's visage would never return to its original form. He had become a puppet, devoid of emotions or volition, forever destined to serve his mistress. A thud succeeded by a crash reverberated from the entrance of the alleyway. The Annihilator, in an attempt to escape, suddenly plummeted from midair. Upon hitting the ground, he made a loud noise, his body splintering like porcelain into numerous shards, clothes included. No blood stained the shattered ceramic pieces, as if he had always been a kiln-baked clay puppet, his flesh and blood existence nothing more than a transient illusion. Alice was taken aback. A howl akin to a whirlwind emanated from behind her, and Vanna hurried to the alley's entrance. She stared incredulously at the spectacle and hesitated for a long time before turning to the puppet beside her. "Is this you're doing?" "I don't know." Alice blinked, her response lagging. Probably." "What do you mean, probably?" "I caught his thread and then yanked it hard. He assaulted first, and I was scared." Alice's explanation was disjointed and replete with gestures. Her account was so efficient that Vanna grew more perplexed with each word. "Do you understand?" "No." Vanna shook her head, then glanced back at the scorched wreckage at the depth of the alley, from where a faint black smoke was rising. "Damn it. The priest I was dealing with remained silent until the end, and the one you were dealing with shattered completely, leaving no information behind. Does that mean the captain will be unhappy?" "We don't have time to think about that. We need to leave." Vanna spoke hastily. There was too much ruckus. "Even if we're not in the central city area, the night patrol should be on their way." As she spoke, she cast a glance at the house not far away. The confrontation that unfolded within the gloomy confines of the alleyway was intense but fleeting. Mere minutes elapsed from the instant the pair of shadowy cultists revealed their presence to the conclusion of their bitter fight. Vanna was firmly convinced that the brawl that erupted during this brief interval had undoubtedly echoed loud enough to rouse the night patrol guards of Frost. Despite this, Vanna harbored no fear of Frost's nocturnal protectors. Her status, as well as her abilities, far outmatched the average city guardian. Regardless, she had no desire to further convolute the situation at hand. Just as she was pondering over the best way to establish contact with Duncan and inform him of the fight, a sudden commotion from the folklorist's residence drew her attention. The front door swung open abruptly, revealing Duncan and Morris stepping out into the moonlit night. With a brisk gait, Duncan moved toward Vanna and Alice, waiting in the alley, while Morris secured the door behind them. As he did so, he was drawing peculiar, antiquated symbols in the air, as though invoking the god of wisdom for a potent blessing. "The disturbance outside caught my attention," Duncan informed Vanna and Alice as he approached, surveying the scene in the alley with a quick glance. A hint of concern marked his features. "What transpired here?" "We suspected cultist surveillance on this location, and Alice confirmed it." A brief skirmish ensued. Vanna answered without hesitation. the heretics have been eliminated, with no escapees. However, the clamor of our clash may have already alerted the night patrols, who should arrive shortly. Alice detected them. Duncan turned to the doll standing next to him with a look of surprise. He then noticed a certain peculiarity in Vanna's countenance and quickly discerned that the situation might be more complex than he had anticipated. Despite this, he chose not to inquire further, responding with a simple nod. "This isn't the time for elaborations. We need to mobilize." "I have effectively erased any evidence of our actions here," Morris chimed in, having completed his task. "Garloni will have no recollection of the past 24 hours when she awakens. Even an expert mind physician would struggle to piece together the events." "That's good to hear," Duncan replied, showing a hint of relief. He had never overly concerned himself with covering their tracks, but fewer disruptions at the commencement of their mission would undoubtedly prove beneficial. Raising his hand, he gestured into the darkness. The silence of the night was suddenly ruptured by the sound of fluttering wings. A dove, previously perched on a neighboring rooftop, swiftly took flight, soon disappearing into the black of the night. A green flame briefly illuminated the alleyway before the calm returned, disturbed only by the faint echo of the dove's departing wings. A few minutes later, the sound of hurried footsteps and the sway of lanterns in the distance signaled the arrival of the anticipated night patrol. The departing dove hadn't flown far, landing near an abandoned factory just a block away, inside a dilapidated tin shack. The shack, nestled close to the factory, bore a sizable hole in one of its windows. I flitted through this opening, and as its spirit flame flared, the forms of Duncan and his companions materialized within the shack's confines. Vanna's gaze swept over the grimy, dust-covered interior of the makeshift refuge. A threadbare wooden bed, along with a crude table and chairs, huddled in one corner, while the other side of the room was heaped with a jumble of random items. A chill wind moaned outside, and the broken window whistled eerily in response. This was initially intended as a temporary shelter for the pump room maintenance crew. Usually, it remains vacant outside of the maintenance period. We don't know when the next maintenance is due, but for tonight, this place will suffice as a temporary refuge, Vanna said, turning her attention to the window. Through the grime-streaked glass, she could make out the silhouette of the old factory in the distance. Its lights shone brightly, and the hum of machinery was audible even from where they stood. The factory is still operational, and there's bound to be a priest on duty round the clock. If any supernatural conflicts occur nearby, the alert levels at the factory will inevitably escalate. That's not an issue. Just ensure we don't light any lamps. They won't detect our presence here, Duncan replied, seemingly unconcerned. We'll hold out here till dawn and then proceed. Is everyone okay with that? His gaze swept over his companions. Alice was a cursed doll, Vanna was an accomplished young warrior, and Morris, though seemingly frail, was an extraordinary individual gifted with divine powers. Duncan was confident in their collective strength, but he did worry that the bone-chilling winter nights of the northern city might not be kind to the elderly Morris. "Rest assured," Morris responded, seemingly aware of Duncan's concern. A soft smile graced his lips as he traced the sacred rune of Lehem, the god of wisdom, on his chest. "Until a couple of years ago, I frequently braved ancient ruins and cursed wastelands on perilous seashores. The challenges there were far more dangerous than our current situation. Scholarly pursuits have never been easy, especially when they involve delving into history." Duncan contemplated this and found himself agreeing with the old gentleman. In their world, historians and folklorists truly represented the hardcore professions. Even those confined to their homes had to possess extraordinary skills to confront the subjects of their studies, be they cursed manuscripts or possessed relics that refused to lay dormant in exhibit halls. Regarding an all-around scholar like Morris, Duncan mused he probably mastered combat and survival skills before venturing into the realm of history. "We might also reach out to Captain Tyrion's informants stationed within the city," Vanna suggested. "They could potentially arrange for lodgings and provide us with useful intel." "I will get in touch with them, but not right now," Duncan waved his hand dismissively, his expression sobering. "Henceforth, we need to be cautious with anyone we come into contact with in Frost, and this includes Tyrion's so-called informants." Taken aback, Vanna quickly grasped his implication. "You're confirming that, Scott Brown." He was a deep-sea replica, and he self-destructed before we could reach him. We were a step too late and only managed to uncover a handful of clues he left behind, Duncan stated, shaking his head ruefully. However, we did anticipate this scenario. Additionally, we found a female apprentice suffering from cognitive disorientation and memory loss in that house. She was an ordinary individual. Vanna's expression hardened at this revelation. That was Brown's student, Garloni. She has absolutely no recollection of her tutor's shipwreck incident, Morris added. Based on our assessment, this situation might not be an isolated incident in Frost. Tyrion started receiving odd, contradictory reports over a fortnight ago. These reports sometimes mentioned instances of the dead returning in Frost. At other times, they dismissed these incidents as mere rumors, claiming that the so-called deceased was, in fact, longtime residents of Frost. Occasionally, we'd receive conflicting reports from the same source, Duncan continued. Initially, Tyrion thought that the Frost authorities were manipulating the information flow and that the Death Church was acting to minimize the effects of these bizarre incidents on its residents. But now, it appears, it's more likely the result of cognitive distortion. You're implying that this cognitive and memory corruption has infected the entire city-state. Vanna comprehended the gravity of the situation. So, in this city-state right now, it's hard to gauge the ratio of replicas to originals. But that's a secondary issue, as I can swiftly distinguish the replicas upon meeting them. The real concern is the ordinary folk who are no longer ordinary, Duncan said, pausing briefly before shaking his head. In any case, Tyrion's informants in this city are no longer reliable. Some may have been replaced, some might have had their cognition distorted, and some could even be spies for the cult of obliteration. We need to exercise caution while dealing with them. Vanna nodded gravely, but deep within her eyes, a flicker of joy was kindling. The mysterious northern city-state, plagued by an undercurrent of replacement and suspicion. Former spies deemed unreliable, seemingly harmless citizens gradually experiencing distortions in memory and cognition. Deceptive voices echoing throughout the city, with the corruption spreading like a hidden blight. She found this promising, as it all fell within her domain of expertise, purging heresy and cleansing corruption. She began to understand why Pope Helena had dispatched her to the Vanished. Even though the nightscape in Plan now bore a tranquil visage, she would always have a role to play as long as she stayed with the Vanished. Duncan regarded Vanna with a curious expression. Is it my imagination, or did your mood just improve significantly? Ah, I was just contemplating the continuation of our crusade against heresy, and that makes me rather happy. Duncan was momentarily at a loss for words, not sure how to assess the young inquisitor's enthusiasm. However, he quickly shifted his attention to another matter. His gaze landed on the doll who was daydreaming nearby. Now that Morris and I have shared our updates, it's time for you to fill us in on your side of things. In Alice's mind, the world's reality was experienced in a unique manner compared to most people. For her, the world had always been like a dynamic painting where the rules of reality twisted and turned differently. This unusual way of perceiving the world was an inherent part of her, a silent, ever-present companion that had been concealed from the world until now. Yet, Alice had not grasped the full extent of its significance. The tale of Alice's supernatural exploits during the back alley conflict had reached Duncan, courtesy of Vanna. She described an array of surreal events, from Alice identifying hidden enemies via spectral, floating lines, to the transformation of a fleeing cultist into a brittle figure resembling shattered porcelain. Duncan was left in awe, grappling with the reality of what he'd just heard. As the narrative unfolded, all eyes were drawn to Alice, now the central figure in this unfolding story. Every move she made, every reaction she exhibited, was closely observed and analyzed. So, it seems none of you can see these lines. Alice's realization dawned on her slowly, her voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. As she scratched her head in confusion, her wide eyes twinkled with wonder. I simply assumed everyone could see them since these lines ensnare everyone's head and limbs. With a serious expression carved on his face, Duncan stared intently into Alice's eyes and asked for further clarification, just to make sure. These lines, you see, they surround everyone, right? Yes, they do. But you're an exception, Captain, Alice replied quickly, her voice brimming with confidence. Duncan fell silent, processing her response, before posing another question. Do you mean to say that these lines were absent in my original form, or is it that my current form lacks them? It's your current form, Alice replied truthfully, adding, and you also didn't have them when we were implanned. Duncan acknowledged her explanation with a nod, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. In Alice's peculiar perception of the world, these spectral lines surrounded everyone except him, and even the forms he had assumed in the past were devoid of these lines. Could these lines be linked to something more profound than physical bodies? Could they represent an individual's soul or perhaps their unique personality? Under certain circumstances, Alice could grasp these lines, using them as a tool to control or attack her enemies. But what was the origin of this supernatural ability? Was it an innate skill she had as Anomaly 099, a secret she had managed to hide until now, or was it a new development following her alliance with the Vanished? While he pondered over these thoughts, Duncan continued to watch Alice intently. His unwavering stare began to unsettle even the usually unfazed Alice. She squirmed uncomfortably under his gaze, expressing her unease. Captain, you're staring at me too hard, it's making me anxious. Caught off guard by her complaint, Duncan immediately softened his gaze, a hint of embarrassment washing over his face. He then turned to Vanna, voicing his thoughts. As far as I understand, Alice's official designation has now been updated to Anomaly 099 doll, correct? Vanna acknowledged Duncan's observation with a nod, attempting to follow the trajectory of his thoughts. Are you suggesting that Alice's abilities have evolved in line with this recent change? She asked, curiosity piqued. Perhaps. Duncan's voice was calm and measured as he explained his hypothesis. The coffin and the doll might have inherently different powers. The coffin symbolized death, embodying a raw, brutal force capable of beheading. On the other hand, the doll, resembling a human figure, appears to be linked with the ability to manipulate humanoid entities. Originally, Alice was merely the resident of the coffin, hence the composite nature of Anomaly 099 predominantly displayed the coffin's characteristics. But now, the doll has become the leading component of Anomaly 099, and her inherent abilities have emerged. Different powers harbored within the coffin and the doll. Morris, who had been unusually silent till now, echoed the theory. That does sound like a plausible explanation. A wave of emotion washed over Duncan as he mulled over their shared hypothesis. He had always thought that Anomaly 99's immense power had diminished. After Alice's transformation from her wooden box form, she seemed to have regressed into an eerily animated, mobile doll, displaying both frailty and timidity. He hadn't anticipated that she would manifest such a supernatural ability. It validated her place within the top 100, even though she was arguably weaker than the rest of the Vanished. Throughout this discussion, Alice, true to her simple-minded doll nature, didn't provide much input. She quietly listened in, occasionally looking around. Gradually, she started to understand the gravity of her situation. A look of concern clouded her features, and she asked Duncan in a hesitant tone, Captain, have I done something wrong? Not at all, you did well, Duncan reassured her, shaking his head. You displayed courage and defended yourself aptly. Cultists are never innocents. Feeling somewhat relieved but still unsure, Alice raised her hand in a hesitant gesture. Is my ability evil? Duncan remained silent for a long while, observing the doll in contemplation. Eventually, he broke into a smile. It's a gift. Alice looked perplexed. Can you control it? Duncan questioned further. Yes, I can, Alice responded, nodding and making a waving motion with her hand. It's quite easy, actually. In that case, it indeed is a gift. Duncan's smile broadened. Power itself isn't evil. Losing control of it is what causes chaos. Now, you're capable of contributing even more, Alice. Upon hearing this, Alice's face brightened up with a joyous smile, her body swinging back and forth in excitement. That's great. Seeing everyone so serious, I thought something terrible had happened. To calm her down, Duncan gently patted Alice's hair, careful not to unseat her head due to her exuberant movements. However, despite the calming exterior, his thoughts were anything but at peace. While Duncan now had a better understanding of Alice's abilities and had developed a preliminary theory about the symbolism of the doll and coffin, he was well aware that he had barely scratched the surface of the mysteries she embodied. If anything, his newfound understanding only highlighted the depth of the secrets that the doll, Alice, kept hidden. Alice had been his companion for a considerable time. He had become accustomed to her bubbly demeanor aboard the ship and her innocuous antics as she scurried around him throughout the day. However, before her role as the cook for the Vanished, she was known as Anomaly 099, a formidable entity that had arisen from the frosty depths after the Frost Queen's fall. Fundamentally, she shared her origins with the grotesque and distorted copies. Yet, she differed significantly from any other copy he had met thus far, and he couldn't help but think that this difference wasn't merely a random occurrence. A chilling statement made by the cultist who had appeared following the seagull's explosion resonated in his mind. If it wasn't for that queen, shaking off the swirling thoughts that threatened to consume his focus, Duncan looked up at Vanna and expressed his conclusions. The incidents tonight suggest that the copies that infest the city are indeed the handiwork of the cultists. They are not only working in the shadows, but also clandestinely observing the copies they dispatch into the city. It's as if they're collecting some form of data. Drawing from her past experiences, Vanna agreed, they seem to be laying the groundwork for a larger-scale operation. The copies currently in the city are likely just the initial phase, and the outbreak on Dagger Island might be a more expansive testing ground. They even attempted to transport the contamination from Dagger Island to Frost's main island. Though we managed to intercept their operation, it's a clear indication that their plan is reaching a critical stage. There's no need to worry, I'll step in when the time is right. But first, we need to pinpoint their base, Duncan stated nonchalantly. Simply eliminating a few cultists or priests or destroying a handful of meeting points won't be enough. Our experiences in Plan have already proven that. As he spoke, he lifted his gaze, peering through the narrow opening between his bandages and the grimy window beside him. His eyes scanned the snow-covered rooftops and eaves of the city of Frost. "Where are you hiding?" With these words, the wind whipped up into a furious gale, and a new shower of snowflakes began to fall. The streets in the distance became blurred as they were hidden behind a curtain of snow. Yet, the darkness couldn't prevail forever. As the first light of dawn began to rise, the remnants of the glowing fracture in the sky withdrew, giving way to the warm, golden-red hues of sunrise that once again bathed the island. The formidable, heavy iron gate of the cemetery creaked in protest as it was forced open. The elderly caretaker, wrapped tightly in a heavy-duty coat, hung the latch used to secure the gate on the surrounding fence. He took a moment to survey the cityscape before him. A thick layer of snow had draped over the entirety of the visible surroundings. The far-off streets had blurred into indistinct outlines beneath the icy cover, transforming into an expansive landscape of pristine white. Despite the snowy blanketing, the city was far from dormant. Pipes bristling above the city streets expelled plumes of white mist as the thermal energy produced by the steam core was distributed to key locations. This effectively melted the accumulated ice and snow, clogging the vital hubs of the pipe network and power stations. Simultaneously, hefty snow removal machinery had been deployed. With their deep grumbles and plumes of thick smoke, these machines plowed down the streets, clearing crucial transit pathways. Following their recent visitors' departure, the cemetery had returned to its customary tranquil state, free of any abnormal incidents. However, neither the caretaker nor the church-appointed guardians had relaxed their vigilance. In the later part of the night, an urgent message had arrived via the high-pressure steam pipes at the caretaker's cabin. The message had been dispatched from City Hall and was peculiar in its content. It issued a call for an elevated state of vigilance among all city guardians, yet offered no explanation for the increased alert level. After receiving some confidential information shortly afterward, Agatha sent out a small team to Fireplace Street. Unfortunately, there was yet to be any news from the dispatched guardians. The wind and snow had only grown more severe in the latter half of the night. The violent gusts and tumultuous swirls of snowflakes seemed to be an ominous harbinger of some impending event. "Damned weather," the old caretaker grumbled under his breath, pulling his coat even more snugly around him. The seasoned caretaker of the aged graveyard held no affection for those relentless snowy days. It was not merely because the icy temperatures aggravated his stiff and aching joints, but because such days were harbingers of sad reminders from his past. These bitter recollections were not pleasant. They were shadowed by events such as the insurgency that occurred half a century ago, the devastating frost calamity that struck 3 decades ago, or the monumental catastrophe that befell the southern urban district 17 years ago. It seemed as though heavy snowfall was inexorably tied with disastrous news. With chapped hands rubbed together for warmth, the elderly man turned his gaze back to the snow-enshrouded graveyard. The relentless snowfall rendered the cemetery pathways nearly invisible, leaving only the footprints, cutting a lonely path towards the morgue and the caretaker's lodge. The gas lamps had been doused, their dark, skeletal frames standing eerily like the remains of deceased trees amidst the blanket of white, portraying a bleak picture of isolation. A few steam-powered cars sat idle in the cemetery's open area, thoroughly obscured by the encompassing snow. Their guardians, clad in stark black, battled against the onslaught of snow, fervently trying to clear a passage for the vehicles, a chaotic spectacle. It was crucial to accomplish this task before the snow hardened and made the clearance work even more arduous. A harsh wind bellowed, carrying with it a fleeting wisp of gray smoke. From within this whirlwind, the silhouette of Agatha materialized. The youthful gatekeeper approached the old caretaker. "Half of our team will depart today, leaving only 2 squads behind to assist you in protecting the graveyard. All of them can leave if they choose. It would be rather peaceful," the elderly caretaker retorted, his eyelids lifting to cast a glance at the gatekeeper. "Having such a crowd here is merely a wasteful extravagance." "Extravagance or not, it's not your concern. Don't worry about any manpower shortage on my end. Believe me, I'm far from idle enough to be bothered about your affairs," grumbled the caretaker. Nonchalantly, he mentioned, "You dispatched an elite team late last night. Has there been some trouble in the city?" Agatha examined the old man. "Are you still concerned about occurrences beyond these cemetery walls?" "I'm just making conversation. Whether you choose to respond is entirely up to you," shrugged the old caretaker. "There was an incident on Fireplace Street. A potent supernatural entity caused quite a stir. The patrol guards responded but came back empty-handed," Agatha narrated at a deliberate pace. "For now, all we know is that a cult member was involved. They met a gruesome end, with one exhibiting a peculiar manner of death not aligned with any known supernatural abilities." The old caretaker's eyebrows visibly flinched at this revelation, and he took on a more solemn tone. "Fireplace Street. Rest assured, no innocent bystanders were harmed." Agatha intuitively understood the caretaker's worries and promptly addressed them. Nevertheless, the squad reported multiple peculiar pieces of evidence from the scene. "I might need to personally inspect it." The elderly caretaker offered no verbal response, only a gentle nod. But the intensity in his gaze revealed a shift in his demeanor. Despite her youth, Agatha's title of gatekeeper was not arbitrarily awarded. It was hard-earned through intense training and demanding evaluations. As the highest-ranking representative of the church in the city-state, her actions in themselves served as a clear indication of the urgency of the situation. What unfolded on Fireplace Street was likely far more complicated than the supernatural altercation she described, certainly not as trivial as her seemingly nonchalant attitude might suggest. If a team of elite guardians was dispatched only for the gatekeeper herself to ultimately step in, it suggested the incident was far from minor. Nevertheless, that was a situation beyond the confines of the graveyard, beyond what he, as a retired gravekeeper, needed to concern himself with. It was a task for the young gatekeeper and the guardians. After an arduous bout of snow clearing, the guardians managed to start the steam cores of the vehicles. 2 slate-gray steam cars departed the graveyard, quickly vanishing down the narrow road leading to the urban blocks. The old caretaker observed the departure of the 2 vehicles, shook his head, and readied himself to return to his graveyard duties. However, just as he was about to pivot, a familiar diminutive silhouette caught his eye at the road's end. A little girl, swathed in a bulky coat, was trudging towards the graveyard with noticeable difficulty. The old caretaker instantly halted, watching as the small figure drew closer. A trace of irritation surfaced on his weathered face, but the little figure also spotted him standing sentinel-like at the cemetery's entrance. She paused by the roadside, craned her face upward, waved her arm in a joyous gesture, and continued her uneven advance towards the old man. Eventually, she found her footing on the tire tracks left by the recently departed steam cars, making her steps somewhat easier. Bending down to dust the snowflakes off her clothes, she stood at the entrance of the cemetery, beaming up at the stern, even somewhat irate, caretaker. "Grandpa Caretaker, I'm back," Annie greeted the old caretaker in her jubilant tone. Her outfit, a thick, white coat, matching boots, and a woolen hat, blended seamlessly into the snow-draped cityscape. "You should not be out in such inclement weather, especially venturing to a place like this," the old caretaker rebuked, his eyes wide and his tone severe. "You'll cause your family unnecessary worry." "My mom knows I'll be back soon," retorted Annie, her youthful face flushed from the biting cold, a broad smile accenting her rosy cheeks. "We're on school break, and I had planned to play with my friends. But they chose to stay indoors, so I decided to visit you instead. Rather than braving your way to the graveyard in this snow-laden weather, you should have stayed home like your friends," the elderly man replied frostily. "The cemetery is closed today due to the heavy snowfall. I suggest you go home." The girl, however, appeared not to heed his words. She tilted her head to peek past the caretaker and raised her face, a sense of anticipation twinkling in her eyes. "And my dad? He did not come," the old man stated bluntly. "With the weather in such a dreadful state, any scheduled funeral would be postponed." Annie paused, showing no evident disappointment. Her lips tightened as she queried, "So, I'll come back when the weather is better. He will come then, right?" The old caretaker held his silence, looking deep into the young girl's hopeful eyes. A pang of regret washed over him for a promise made 6 years ago that her father would return. At that time, his heart had simply been too tender. After what felt like an eternity, the old man finally managed to utter, "Perhaps one day, you will receive news of him." This was the most gentle response he could muster. A 12-year-old child should be able to grasp the underlying meaning by now. A bright smile suddenly illuminated Annie's face. She dove into her small bag and retrieved a parcel, which she enthusiastically handed to the old man. "Another batch of cookies?" The old caretaker quizzically raised an eyebrow. "No, it's ginger tea powder. My mom and I made it together and added some warming herbs to combat the cold," Annie said, her chest puffed up with pride as she thrust the package into the old man's hands. "Since you're here alone guarding the cemetery, it must get terribly cold at night, right?" The old man studied the package resting in his hands. He didn't particularly need it. The potions the church provided to the grave keepers were far superior in efficacy to any homemade remedy. His humble caretaker's lodge was equipped with protective charms and special materials. It could withstand the cold winds and any external disruption in case the cemetery's equilibrium was disrupted. His lodge was nothing short of a fortress of steel. "Thank you," he finally said, accepting Annie's gift. A seldom-seen smile crept onto his face, slightly awkward due to lack of use. "This will come in handy." His expression resumed its usual sternness. "I've accepted your offering, now you should hurry home. And for the next few days, try to refrain from going outside." "Why? The city is not very safe at the moment," the old caretaker relayed solemnly. The news Agatha had shared, particularly about the supernatural incident on Fireplace Street the previous night, weighed heavily on his mind. "Return home and advise your mother to stay indoors as much as possible. If you notice anything unusual, seek assistance immediately from the nearest church or security officer. Annie, this is important, do you understand?" Taken aback by the sudden gravity in the old man's tone, Annie hastily bobbed her head in understanding. I understand." "Good, now head home," the old man sighed, gently shooing her away, "while the weather is still." He abruptly halted mid-sentence, his gaze drawn upward. A striking figure, unusually tall and muscular, had materialized near the cemetery's entrance and was looking in their direction. He was garbed in a black trench coat and wide-brimmed hat, with bandages swathed around his face, his attire in bandages leaving no hint of his features exposed. Alongside this imposing figure stood a dainty woman adorned in a sophisticated, deep purple gown. Her golden hair cascaded down her shoulders, a soft hat perched on her head, and a veil covered her face. Though her features were obscured, she emanated an aura of elegance and enigma. Despite her intriguing presence, the old caretaker's attention was almost entirely ensnared by the towering, bandaged figure. His gaze was riveted in that direction, seemingly tethered by an unseen force, making it a challenge to avert his eyes. A faint, incessant hum filled his mind, and his vision began to tremble and distort at the peripheries, a clear indication of his mind undergoing mild contamination and disruption. The seasoned caretaker immediately discerned what was transpiring. It was that visitor. From their previous encounters and his descent into madness under the effect of incense, a preliminary and essentially harmless connection had been forged with this enigmatic visitor. Consequently, the old caretaker didn't suffer complete paralysis as he had before. He still retained control over his movements, so he swiftly positioned Annie behind him. "Child, do not look in that direction," he warned. Annie found herself bewildered by the unfolding events. She had barely caught sight of two unfamiliar individuals standing ominously by the cemetery gate when her perspective was abruptly obscured by the worn and slightly stooped silhouette of the elderly caretaker. His voice, touched with an unusual tension, reached her ears. "Young one, avert your gaze from that direction." Panic fluttered in her young heart. "What's happening, Grandpa Caretaker?" she queried. "Hold still, and keep your voice down. Everything is under control," the old man returned in a hushed whisper. His stare remained steadfast on the formidable figure approaching them. One of his hands was held out to his side, acting as a barrier to Annie's restless gaze, while his other rested on his chest. Nestled there was an amulet capable of activating the cemetery's emergency alarm, ready to be used if the situation demanded it. As the burly figure closed in, the elderly caretaker could feel his muscles involuntarily tighten. "Good morning," came a deep voice from beneath a mesh of thick bandages, the words reverberating as if echoing from a grave. "I believe this is my first formal visit." The message was clear, and the tone friendly. Much like their past interactions, this mysterious visitor seemed to adopt a peaceful stance. However, the old caretaker couldn't let his guard down. He had anticipated the visitor's return at some point, and he had mentally rehearsed his reactions for various potential scenarios. But he had never predicted such a bold appearance right at the cemetery gate, a face-to-face greeting. The old man was also uncertain about the impact of this encounter on Annie. His only option was to shield her while he figured out the best response. His anxiety was not lost on the visitor, Duncan. The old man seemed even more rattled than during their initial encounter. Was it the young girl he was safeguarding that caused this heightened tension? "Calm down," Duncan suggested, a touch of mirth coloring his voice. "I bear no malice, and I assure you, the child you're protecting will not be harmed. I appreciate your peaceful intentions, but your mere presence could potentially unsettle those unaccustomed to the supernatural," the caretaker responded, choosing his words carefully to avoid offending the visitor. "This young girl has not received any form of training to handle supernatural phenomena." "Well, then she's in no danger," Duncan said. "She can't see what doesn't exist, and you of all people should know that." The caretaker fell silent for a moment. He understood what Duncan was implying, and he knew that Annie, as an ordinary human, shouldn't be affected by certain unearthly forces in the same way he was. Yet, he couldn't fully relax and tentatively asked, "What brings you here this time? Isn't the priestess on these grounds?" Duncan's eyes scanned the depths of the cemetery with curiosity. "I have some crucial information that I need to share with her." "She just stepped out," replied the elderly groundskeeper, his caution escalating at the mention of Agatha. "What business do you have with her?" After a brief pause, he continued, "I can reach out to her when needed. As cemetery wardens, we are part of the clergy and can directly communicate with the cathedral and the gatekeeper." "That's convenient. It'll save me some hassle," said Duncan. He reached into his pocket, a move that visibly heightened the cemetery caretaker's tension. Seeing this, Duncan chuckled and shook his head. "There's no need to be alarmed. If I harbored any harmful intentions, I wouldn't have to make a move." No sooner had he finished speaking than he pulled out a sealed envelope from his coat pocket and handed it over to the elderly man standing before him. "Pass this on to the gatekeeper, Agatha, or directly to your cathedral," Duncan said nonchalantly. "It's just a message. As long as it gets to its intended recipient, that's all that matters." "A letter." He brought a letter. The old groundskeeper appeared genuinely startled by the object the visitor had presented, and he instinctively accepted it. Only after a moment did he comprehend what he was holding, his eyes blinking in surprise. He never anticipated that this enigmatic visitor would physically come to the cemetery simply to deliver a letter to him. He turned the envelope over, examining it closely. On the back side, he recognized the amulet and the number of a small local printing business. It wasn't an enchanted artifact steeped in supernatural power but a simple piece of notepaper likely purchased from a nearby newsstand, maybe even earlier that day. Looking back up, the old man's somewhat cloudy and yellow-tinged eyes reflected his visible bewilderment and curiosity. "Consider it my small contribution to the city-state's security," Duncan offered with a smile, although the friendly expression was hidden behind his bandage-wrapped face. His gaze then shifted beyond the caretaker to the little girl concealed behind him. "Did I frighten you?" "No," Annie replied, shaking her head while cautiously studying the tall, intimidating figure through the gaps between the old man's fingers. "I'm very brave. I have a niece who's also quite courageous," Duncan said, directing his attention back to the elderly man. "This child is just visiting the cemetery, an ordinary girl without any ties to the church," the caretaker quickly intervened. Upon realizing that Annie was truly unaffected by the proceedings, he began to relax slightly. "I was persuading her to head home. The weather isn't very pleasant today. Snowy days can be treacherous." Duncan nodded in agreement before casually asking the young girl, "What's your name? How old are you?" The caretaker's heart clenched. He wanted to caution Annie, who had no previous experience with supernatural entities, to hold her tongue. After all, divulging one's name to an unknown supernatural being of high caliber could pose a significant risk. But his warning came a moment too late. "My name is Annie," the young girl announced without any hesitation, "Annie Babelli, and I'm 12 years old." A hushed stillness immediately descended upon the cemetery gate. Duncan silently observed the little girl, who was now peeking out from behind the elderly caretaker. He scrutinized her eyes and noted the faintly recognizable features she shared with Captain Cristo Babelli. His question had been casual, unpremeditated, but he hadn't expected such an unexpected connection. The crunching sound of footsteps on the snow diverted his attention. Alice appeared surprised as she gazed at the girl who had identified herself as Annie Babelli, before turning to Duncan. "Wait, isn't the surname Babelli familiar? Doesn't it belong to—" Duncan slowly stooped down, ensuring his line of sight was level with the girl's, and adopted a gentler tone. "Your family name is Babelli." Perhaps sensing the shift in the atmosphere, Annie seemed to grow apprehensive, retracting slightly behind the elderly groundskeeper. "Yes, that's correct." "And what is your relation to Captain Cristo Babelli?" He's my father," Annie confessed in a soft voice. She then instinctively clung to the old caretaker's clothes, lifting her gaze to him as if pleading for support. However, the old man was frozen in disbelief as if a thought had struck him. He stared at Duncan, his expression full of incredulity, and then darted a tentative glance towards the veiled, blonde-haired young woman. "You're Captain Cristo's daughter. Do you and your mother reside on Fireplace Street?" Duncan inquired of the little girl before him. Annie nodded vigorously, then seemed to have a realization. Did you know my father?" "We've met, although we weren't particularly close," Duncan confessed gently. "He asked me to keep an eye on you and your mother. I haven't had the opportunity to locate you until now, and I certainly didn't expect to run into you here." Surprise blossomed in Annie's wide eyes. The elderly groundskeeper by her side was equally taken aback. "My father," Annie began, struggling to formulate her thoughts into words. After wrestling with her thoughts for a moment, she finally ventured, "He truly is dead, isn't he?" With a tender nod, Duncan confirmed her worst fears. "Then, will his remains be brought here?" Annie blurted out. "Adults say that believers in the god of death have their souls returned to Bartok's cemetery after passing, where they're guided towards that grand gate. The caretaker once told me that this cemetery is—" Annie's voice dwindled as she spoke, becoming almost inaudible. She had ceased to believe in the tales the old man had once spun for her. After all, she was 12 now, old enough to know better. Suddenly, Duncan extended his hand, ruffling Annie's hair affectionately. Snowflakes that hadn't melted fell from her dense woolen hat, merging with the snow already blanketing the ground. Captain Christo was a remarkable man, and he has already found tranquil rest in Bartok's dominion. Annie looked up, blinking in confusion. She couldn't fully grasp the implication of Duncan's words. In fact, she was still wrestling with understanding the true essence of the towering, enigmatic figure before her. However, the elderly caretaker by her side did understand, and an epiphany dawned on him. With a swift motion, the old man placed his hand on Annie's shoulder, gesturing for her to refrain from further conversation. Then, locking his gaze with Duncan's, he asked, "Is what you're asserting the absolute truth?" "I believe it to be so," Duncan pondered for a moment. He didn't deeply understand the so-called Bartok's portal into the afterlife or what the human experience would entail post-death. But standing in front of a child, he recognized the words that needed to be spoken. These were also the sentiments he sincerely harbored. "I personally escorted him to his final journey." The elderly caretaker's pupils dilated briefly, but he was quick to hide any alterations in his countenance. "I ought to be departing soon," Duncan announced, casting a glance at Annie, who still appeared somewhat perplexed. He then shifted his gaze back to the cemetery caretaker. "While there is much to discuss, I have numerous obligations waiting for me. There will be other opportunities for us to meet. And remember the letter." The elderly caretaker blinked, about to voice a response. However, before he could articulate his thoughts, the spectral green flame disappeared in a swift burst. The unexpected visitor had made a swift and abrupt exit, just as their arrival had been sudden and unanticipated. The seasoned caretaker of the old cemetery stood in stunned silence, his gaze still fixated on the spot where the spectral flames had evaporated into nothingness. His mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, trying to process the flurry of information that the fleeting interaction had thrown his way. He stood there, caught in the hold of this puzzling event, until a gentle pull at his sleeve brought him back to the present. Dropping his gaze, he found young Annie looking up at him with a troubled expression. Her eyes were a pool of uncertainty, anxiousness, and deep puzzlement. Even though she had come to terms with the harsh realities of life and death at such a tender age, the bizarre events that had just unfolded were beyond her grasp. The old caretaker crouched down, the winter chill seeping into his aged, stiff joints and causing a mild, familiar ache. He reached out, brushing off the falling snowflakes from Annie's shoulder, and assured her, "Annie, there's no need to be scared, nothing untoward has happened." "Grandpa caretaker," Annie started, her lips moving in a futile attempt to articulate her confusion. "That person just now." "Sweetheart, don't ask too many questions, don't overthink. Just like we're taught in school, don't delve too deep into knowledge that's beyond the comprehension of us mere mortals. All you need to understand is that the visitor meant no harm, and now that they've left, our ties with them cease to exist." "What about my father?" "Your father might have achieved something truly supernatural, something that we can't even fathom," the caretaker replied gently, patting her on the head. "Don't worry, Annie, your father is not lost at sea anymore. He's moved on to a better place. Go home and share this news with your mother, she has been anxiously waiting for it." Hesitant, Annie pressed her lips together before finally voicing her concern in a soft whisper. "Is it for real this time?" "Yes, Annie, it's for real," the caretaker smiled. "You're not a little girl anymore." Annie gave a nod of understanding, bidding the old caretaker farewell. She turned and began her journey towards the neighborhood, following the clear tire tracks on the otherwise snow-laden path, gradually making her way home and disappearing into the silver-white canvas of the city. The caretaker stood at the cemetery entrance, watching her recede into the distance until her silhouette was swallowed up by the intersection. The young girl hadn't stumbled on her way this time. He sighed a breath of relief and reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the letter that lay within. The unexplainable visitor had left behind an innocuous-looking piece of paper, but the caretaker had an inkling that it carried knowledge and mysteries beyond comprehension. What was the significance of this letter? His gaze turned grave as he turned around to walk back into the somber confines of the cemetery. As he left, he waved a hand behind him, and with a dull creak, the heavy iron gate swung shut. The gates of the cemetery were to remain shut for the remainder of the day. Agatha peered intensely at the fragmented remains scattered across the ground. Her long hair danced in the persistent icy wind that whistled through the narrow alley. The biting cold air sneaked its way into the crevices of her clothing and her bandages, seemingly cementing the terror and despair that marked the final moments of the two defeated cultists. Several guards dressed in black were bustling about nearby. The first response team that had arrived on the scene had swiftly cordoned off the alley entrance, and now, personnel were meticulously combing through the adjacent alleyways, scouring for clues. The evidence collection process was systematic, yet Agatha's heart remained riddled with perplexity. What sort of formidable force had the power to shatter a person into fragments, akin to a delicate porcelain doll meeting an untimely end? Up to this point, no known divine or heretical incantations were known to inflict such a peculiar effect. Even the most nefarious of curses wielded by the enigmatic demons hadn't shown signs of inducing such bizarre phenomena. A young gatekeeper maneuvered his staff, employing its metallic end to prod at one of the fragments. The ceramic-like, pallid piece teetered and flipped, creating a sharp, distinct sound as it made contact with the ground. Once flipped, it revealed a partial face, lips, the bridge of the nose, and a single eye. Although incomplete, it portrayed the last moments of the cultist with chilling clarity, an explicit expression of terror etched onto his features at the time of death. And was that a trace of a peculiar smile? Agatha knitted her brows together, her attention drawn to the uncanny upward curve on the porcelain-like fragment's lips. It appeared as if a tranquil smile was in the process of forming, yet it had been abruptly halted in its tracks. This ambiguous curve, juxtaposed with the fearful eye, rendered the facial fragment exceedingly eerie and unnerving. After a moment of contemplation, Agatha shook off her thoughts and proceeded further down the alley to another grim scene. A heap of charred debris lay strewn across the alley, the surrounding area showing signs of a fierce battle and ensuing explosions. The extent of the damage was vast, yet it was apparent that the fight had been heavily lopsided, the combat style distinctly different from the one that had resulted in the fragments at the alley's entrance. A priest, who had been examining the scene, rose to his feet beside the pile of remains. He stripped off his gloves and inclined his head towards Agatha. This is the work of a fully cleansed annihilation priest. Judging by the degree of his flesh mutation, he was a formidable adversary. In theory, he should have been able to hold his own against a fully manned 12-person guard squad, possibly even managing to escape. Yet, he was swiftly neutralized, and there's scarcely any evidence of a counterattack. Agatha's brow furrowed deeper. Can you discern who or what he was up against? The priest shook his head. It seems to be the most straightforward and brutal mode of attack, raw physical force. This makes it challenging to pinpoint the identity of the adversary. However, we did find a peculiar residue of condensed water vapor in the vicinity, which may be our only lead. Condensed water vapor, just that as a clue, Agatha murmured, casting a glance back towards the entrance of the alley, two drastically contrasting styles of combat. Indeed, one is basic yet ferocious, and the other is peculiar and treacherous. However, both methods display one commonality: their formidable power. Cleric-level heretics didn't stand a chance, the priest agreed. The only sliver of good news is that these unknown entities appear to be adversaries of the annihilation cult. An enemy of our enemy doesn't necessarily translate to our friend, Agatha responded, shaking her head, especially when they seem to be intent on concealing their activities. Their reticence to reveal themselves is a troubling matter. She paused briefly before asking, what have we learned from interrogating the surrounding residents? The local residents heard the commotion of the battle but were largely too terrified to investigate. Their accounts help us ascertain the time and duration of the altercation. It commenced after 1 a.m. and presumably lasted less than 3 minutes. Is that the extent of our information? Isn't there anything else? For now, there's no more to share. The priest gestured expansively. I've dispatched teams to conduct door-to-door inquiries, including probing the more distant alleyways, for any accounts of unfamiliar faces lurking around. However, considering the vast expanse of Fireplace Street, it's unlikely we'll uncover anything substantial in the short term. Their discussion was suddenly interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching from the adjacent street. A guardian with a mop of short brown hair quickly made his way into the alley, delivering his report to the priest. Inside the building, the priest furrowed his brow as he listened to the subordinate's account, casting a glance up at the building that stood diagonally across the alley. Upon witnessing this, Agatha inquired immediately, What's the matter? In house number 42, the priest responded, an orc woman was found assaulted by an unearthly power, leaving her in an unconscious state. Moreover, a room on the second floor was discovered, tainted by an unidentified object. Meanwhile, within the confines of the cemetery's guardhouse, the elderly caretaker methodically secured the door. With a grave expression, he made his way over to the desk nestled in a corner. He had instructed the guardians stationed outside to remain vigilant in the vicinity of the guardhouse. Meanwhile, he had set up protective measures in the surrounding open space but was acutely aware that these defenses may not suffice. Upon reaching the desk, he drew out various items from a drawer: incense, essential oils, candles, and a collection of herbal powders, and began to meticulously construct a potent spiritual altar. He positioned candles at specific points, anointing them with the essential oils and sprinkling them with the herbal powders. Filling the room with the sanctifying aroma of incense, he positioned the incense burner at the core of the circular candle arrangement, symbolizing the creation of a sacred space. He executed each step with precision and skill, each movement an echo of countless repetitions past. Such was the precision of a seasoned warrior. Within mere minutes, the altar stood completed. The old caretaker took a moment to draw in a deep breath, his gaze lingering on the ghostly flames dancing atop the candles, and the thin tendrils of incense smoke twirling upward from the table. He could sense the divine presence of the god of death, Bartok, temporarily inhabiting the guardhouse. The holy essence hovered near the desk, serving to steady the progression of time and space, and in doing so, fortifying his spirit. No precautions were deemed excessive or over-detailed when dealing with knowledge that defied comprehension. He eased himself into the chair, silently reciting a prayer, then with a grave countenance, he withdrew the letter from his pocket for inspection. It was an item the mysterious visitor had entrusted him to deliver to gatekeeper Agatha, yet he had indicated that it would suffice to dispatch the message to the silent cathedral. There were no instructions forbidding others from perusing the letter. If his only responsibility were to relay the message, reading the letter himself and then passing on the information would be deemed permissible. After all, as the cemetery caretaker, he served as the primary line of defense to the cathedral. The elderly man drew in a deep breath, his preparations complete, and picked up the letter opener resting beside him. With utmost care, he breached the seal of the seemingly ordinary envelope, causing a folded piece of parchment to tumble out. His expression solemn like never before, a resolve akin to that of a martyr glistening in his eyes, the old caretaker gingerly unfurled the paper. The words, "Report letter," leapt into view, sending the old caretaker into a wildering pause. The guardhouse fell into an unnerving silence that seemed to permeate the air as though the very atmosphere had congealed into an unsettling stillness. At that moment, the elderly custodian felt awed, as if reality had taken on a dreamlike quality, tricking him into believing that time had frozen in its tracks. It felt as if the shrine on his desk, the delicate flame of the candle, the gentle wafts of incense smoke, and the ambient spiritual energy suspended in the air had all momentarily ceased their natural progression. Could this be merely an illusion? Uncertain, the old man lifted his gaze, catching sight of the candle flame dancing within his field of vision as if it had only commenced its lively flicker the moment his gaze fell upon it. His eyes lingered on the pale, dancing flame for a long moment before slowly shaking his head, dismissing his strange sensations. His attention was then redirected back to the letter laid out in front of him. As his eyes began to scan the words, he experienced an uncanny emotion he had never felt before. However, after traversing through a mere few lines, he could no longer dwell on the peculiarities of his feelings. The content of the letter demanded immediate attention, forcing him to realize the gravity of the unfolding situation. Warnings indicating that their city-state was being slowly corroded and infiltrated by the profound forces of the deep sea. Clear evidence of the ominous annihilation cult orchestrating large-scale operations. Intriguing speculations regarding the mysterious saint's encroachment into the mortal realm. And finally, an alarming alert concerning Dagger Island. The old custodian studied the lines of the letter with an intense focus. He suddenly felt an unnerving realization that the recent inexplicable tensions permeating throughout their city-state had found their plausible cause. While he was uncertain whether he should trust this report, derived from an inexplicable entity, he was sure about one thing: it was of utmost importance to inform the gatekeeper and the cathedral immediately. Meanwhile, Agatha was carefully observing the orc woman, who was soundly asleep on the sofa. Completely oblivious to the large assembly of guardians congregating in the room, the orc woman occasionally mumbled in her sleep. The fact that she could articulate words while sleeping suggested that her consciousness remained intact during the earlier attack, and that the unexpected visitor who had entered their dwelling did not harbor any harmful intentions. Agatha's eyes drifted over the orc woman's figure, noted as robust in her observation. Most orcs were built this way, inherently endowed with muscular physiques and skin as resilient as stone. After conducting a quick assessment, the young gatekeeper noted the woman's muscles occasionally tensing in rhythm with her restless mumblings. It seemed her dreams were filled with unrest and unease. No external injuries, no signs of mental corruption, no evidence of a physical altercation, and her condition seems akin to natural sleep. Though she remains unresponsive, a priest dressed in a gray-white robe reported his findings to Agatha, providing an overview of the current situation. Considering the undamaged lock on the door and the evidence of recent cooking activity in the kitchen, we tentatively deduce that the intruder was granted access to the home. It could possibly be someone familiar to the household or a guest who gained her trust, Agatha quietly mused. What about the second floor? We've gathered a significant number of samples and uncovered what appears to be a dying declaration. The individual who left this testament appears to be the source of the unusual substances we found in the room, the priest nodded in response. From additional clues we gathered around the house, we believe the individual who left this testament goes by the name Scott Brown, a folklorist by profession. A folklorist? Agatha furrowed her brows in puzzlement. Have we started investigating his background? We've dispatched someone to the nearest residence's registry office to procure his records. However, we've yet to receive any response. Stay here and continue watching over this woman, Agatha directed, nodding her understanding. I'll go upstairs to evaluate the situation. As you command, gatekeeper. On the second floor, in what appeared to be a study, the guardians had already wrapped up the initial phase of evidence and sample collection. When Agatha arrived, she found her subordinates carefully removing dried mud, clinging to the bookshelves to handle the plethora of books in the room safely. In locations where supernatural occurrences had occurred, books left at the scene could potentially be infected by unearthly energies. Despite potentially being seen as altering the crime scene, it was crucial to relocate and preserve these books for further investigation. Agatha's gaze settled on the dried, gray-black substance. It invoked memories of the samples they had collected from Cemetery No. 3, odd substances resembling primordial matter. She also focused on the aforementioned dying declaration, conspicuously displayed in the center of the desk. Looking at the document, Agatha noted that it had obviously been handled before because it bore distinct marks of careful cleaning. This level of diligence didn't seem characteristic of a malicious intruder. Instead, it reminded her of the professional approach someone like herself would take when investigating a scene. Thinking of the orc lady peacefully sleeping downstairs, Agatha began to form some preliminary hypotheses in her mind. A mysterious third party, who appeared to bear no ill will, could they be the same group that had engaged in a conflict with the followers of Annihilation in the nearby alley? If so, the potential influence of this third party demanded careful scrutiny. As a swirl of speculations and deductions flooded her mind, Agatha slowly scanned the words written on the dying declaration. As she absorbed the impassioned testament, brimming with resolution, bravery, and wisdom, her expression became progressively more solemn and heavy. The individual who had written this record had astonishingly managed to retain conscious awareness and memory. After a brief moment of contemplation, Agatha inhaled softly. With a solemn expression, she carefully returned the dying declaration to its original place on the desk. She then lifted the staff she always had with her and methodically dragged its metallic end across the wooden floor. The resonating sound of metal grating against wood echoed through the room. A ghostly flame ignited at the end of her staff, leaving behind a similarly ethereal, glowing trail on the floor. As the flame and its radiant trace expanded, the frictional sound of the staff scraping the floor began to alter. It grew deep and sluggish, almost like an intangible barrier was forming, gradually segregating the space around her. Before long, Agatha had delineated a triangular area sufficient for an adult to stand within. Then within the triangle, she inscribed the symbol of the death god, Bartok. Once done, she stepped into the center of the enchanted area, propping her staff beside her and reaching for her own eye socket with her free hand. A living eyeball promptly sprung out of its socket, settling comfortably in her palm. In that instant, the surrounding noises ceased abruptly, with all sounds from the material dimension obstructed outside the triangle by the unseen barrier. Then, an array of hushed whispers arose within the silence, reminiscent of a multitude of invisible spectators gathered beyond the confines of the triangle, ceaselessly murmuring undisclosed matters to the gatekeeper. With the palm facing upwards, Agatha raised her hand, using her dislodged eyeball to survey her surroundings. Every element within the room, be it the busy guardians, the dust particles whirling in the air, or the hands of the wall-mounted clock, appeared to be frozen in time, akin to insects trapped in amber. They rapidly lost their vibrancy, fading into a monochrome haze. An otherworldly pallid glow seeped in from the outside through the boarded window, casting delicate shadows within the room. Within this uncanny, luminescent, and stagnant space, only Agatha, standing at the center of the triangle, maintained the hues and semblance of a living being. With her eyes shut, she held her own eyeball in her left hand while she surveyed her surroundings, calmly announcing, "I wish to communicate with the deceased present here." The overwhelming whispers around her abruptly lessened, and Agatha pivoted her left hand, enabling her eyeball to observe the desk nearby. That was where the folklore scholar, Scott Brown, had last labored, leaving behind his final testament. Theoretically, if a spirit had ever resided here, there should be lingering traces of its presence. Although the strange mud scattered across the room suggested the potential habitation of a monster created by supernatural forces, this monster evidently retained fragments of its human nature. Agatha had grown certain of this after reading through the testament. However, she found the space around the vacant desk entirely devoid of any signs of the supernatural. There were no lingering souls, no spectral apparitions formed by emotional attachment, and not even the faintest traces of spiritual remnants. All that was left was a colorless desk laden with piles of the black substance from which thin streams of smoke were rising. Deep in thought, the gatekeeper considered the possibilities while the eyeball oscillated gently within her open palm. Had the soul's remnants dissipated over time due to the entity's demise? Or was the entity occupying the room merely an imitation, never truly human but merely simulating human memories and personality traits? Or had the soul transcended through Bartok's gate, finding solace in the realm of rest? The final hypothesis seemed highly unlikely. After all, considering the room's current condition, if there were any remnants of Scott Brown's soul still lingering, they would have been gravely contaminated. And a tainted soul wouldn't be granted passage through that door. But then, where had the soul vanished to? The whispers surrounding her returned, their murmuring growing louder and more cacophonous than before. The shadows of the spiritual realm started stirring, displaying their clear disdain for the sudden intruder. Even for a potent gatekeeper such as Agatha, it was best not to linger too long in these spectral depths. Holding that thought, Agatha lifted her staff and struck it twice against the floor. The metallic staff's impact against the wooden surface resonated like thunder. Gatekeeper Agatha, envoy of the mortal world, seeks to converse with the gatekeeper of the realm of the deceased, she announced solemnly.